You are watching Her Brave Stories. Subscribe now and tell me in the comments where you're watching from, because today's story begins in a quiet military academy where the halls echoed with arrogance, ego, and the smug confidence of recruits who believed they understood strength simply because they could shout loud, march in straight lines, and wear uniforms that made them feel untouchable. But everything changed the moment she walked in. A woman in a worn uniform that looked too simple, too old, and too out of place for the polished environment. And the moment the recruits noticed her, laughter flickered between them, shoulders nudged, eyes rolled, and one young man muttered louder than he intended. "Wrong building, sweetheart. The civilian volunteer orientation is down the hall." While another smirked and added, "Or maybe she's lost. Looks like she bought that uniform from a thrift store." And while the room filled with mockery disguised as confidence, she stood there with steady eyes, calm posture, and a silence that wasn't weakness. It was command, and although they didn't know it yet, she held more field hours, more confirmed rescue missions, more classified combat operations, and more service medals than anyone in that entire building, including the instructors. And if the recruits had paused long enough to read the few ribbons on her chest, the ones they wrongly assumed were meaningless, they would have seen one that only 5 living operators in the entire military possessed: the silver Trident Distinguished Combat Pin, a recognition reserved only for a SEAL who completed black-level missions with 0 losses. But instead of respect, one of the recruits stepped closer, eyes full of misplaced superiority, and said, "Ma'am, if you're here to observe, you might want to sit on the sidelines before someone gets hurt, because today we're doing real SEAL-level drills." And that was when the instructor, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a clipboard, finally entered the room, saw her, and immediately straightened his posture, shoulders rising with the reflex of respect drilled into him through years of training. And his voice shifted tone from casual irritation to controlled reverence as he announced, "Recruits, attention." Yet half of them obeyed late, confused, still unaware of the storm they were standing in front of, until the instructor continued, "Officer on deck." And suddenly the careless laughter vanished, spines straightened, feet snapped together, and silence wrapped around the room like a tightening rope. But even then, confusion lingered in their eyes because they still didn't understand who she was, and she didn't help them. She didn't need to. Instead, she simply nodded and said, "As you were," with a voice that wasn't loud but carried authority the way thunder carries a storm, and the recruits returned to their relaxed positions, though this time with caution. But one recruit, with more confidence than wisdom, still smirked and whispered to the person next to him, "Still looks like she came from a Halloween costume aisle," unaware that her ears, trained to detect whispers across battlefield comm interference and heavy static, caught every word. But she didn't react. She simply scanned the room the way predators observe environments, silently, patiently, efficiently. And then she spoke. "Today, you believe you understand what it means to be a SEAL: discipline, strength, endurance, ego." And she paused, walking slowly, letting her boots click against the floor in a rhythm steady like a heartbeat under pressure. But being a SEAL is not about shouting or showing off. It's about surviving when everything, including nature, exhaustion, fear, and death, is trying to erase your existence. And her words hit the room with a weight that silenced even the most arrogant minds. But still, some didn't take her seriously, and one raised his hand without being asked. "Ma'am, with respect, too. Exactly are you supposed to be?" And the instructor flinched, already knowing the regret that sentence would cost. But she turned her head, eyes calm, and answered, "Lieutenant Commander Evelyn Hayes." And the room froze because even the half-educated recruits knew that name, whispered in training bases, printed in classified textbooks, and rumored in missions that never made it to public reports. Missions where hostages walked out alive, while enemy camps vanished without explanation. And yet, one recruit, still unconvinced, responded with forced confidence, "Well, Lieutenant Commander or not, you don't look like the SEALs we're used to seeing." And she finally smiled. Not annoyed, not offended, amused, the way a seasoned warrior smiles at a blade swung by someone who has never bled. And she replied, "Then today, you'll learn what a SEAL really looks like." And before any of them could process the shift in atmosphere, She stepped toward the training mats where weighted dummies, obstacle bars, and closed combat pads were arranged for the drill, and she said, "Instructor, begin evaluation." And he nodded sharply, blowing a whistle so loud it snapped everyone into tension. And the first test was simple, or at least that's what the recruits believed. Sprint 200 meters, climb the rope wall, crawl under barb grid, and return carrying a 150-pound medical dummy, something most recruits already struggled with. And one recruit whispered confidently, "She won't make it halfway." But she didn't wait for motivation, warning, or strategy. Instead, she took off at a pace that didn't look fast, but was deceptively controlled, the kind of movement used by operators who conserve oxygen and maximize acceleration only when needed. And while the first recruit sprinted ahead, breathing hard halfway through, she remained steady, and by the time they reached the rope wall, the young man struggled to hook his boots and grip the rope, but she didn't pause. She jumped, caught the rope midair, and ascended so smoothly it looked unreal, reaching the top before he was even halfway. But she didn't celebrate, didn't smirk. She kept going, dropping into the crawl space and sliding beneath the barbed wire with the precision of someone who had done it in mud, darkness, and live fire. And by the time she reached the final segment, the weighted dummy, a recruit shouted, laughing, "That's heavier than you are." And for the first time, her eyes sharpened with a hint of irritation, not because of the insult, but because they still didn't understand. And then she lifted the dummy not with strain, but with controlled technique, locking her arms beneath its torso and carrying it with the same ease someone might lift a backpack, sprinting back toward the finish line while the rest watched in disbelief. And when she crossed, she didn't pant or bend over. She simply dropped the dummy gently and said, "Next drill," while the recruit who started ahead of her was still crawling under the wires, exhausted, out of breath, cheeks burning with humiliation as he realized the gap wasn't physical. It was mental, earned, and built through years of reality, not training. And yet, even after witnessing that, another recruit stepped forward arrogantly and said, "Physical drills don't define leadership. Close combat does." And she turned to him slowly, asking with a voice that vibrated with challenge, "Are you volunteering?" And before his ego could reconsider, he nodded, stepping into the sparring ring with the confidence of someone who had never been defeated. And the instructor tried to intervene. "Commander, this drill is normally conducted." But she raised one hand, stopping him without hostility. "Standard rules apply. No intentional injury. No strikes to eyes, spine, or throat." And then she stepped into the ring, standing relaxed, hands loose, stance open, almost inviting, almost vulnerable. And the recruit took that bait like every inexperienced fighter does, rushing forward with reckless momentum, swinging wide, predictable punches aimed to intimidate more than land damage. But she moved differently, not with speed, but with prediction, reading his shoulders, breath, foot pressure, and the direction of his knee tilt. And before his fist could reach her, she shifted 1 inch, letting the strike pass by her shoulder while her hand tapped his wrist, redirecting the force, causing him to stumble. And the room gasped because it didn't look like defense. It looked like awareness, like she could see his movement before he made it. And he tried again, more aggressively now, throwing a kick and a backhand combination, but she ducked, pivoted, and within 2 seconds, she had him locked with one arm pinned behind his back and his balance tilted forward, 1 step away from the floor, and she whispered, calm and steady, "Fighting with emotion is fighting blind," before releasing him gently and stepping back, giving him dignity instead of defeat. But his pride couldn't handle mercy, and he lunged again without warning, a clear breach of rules. And this time she didn't hold back. She caught his wrist, twisted, redirected his momentum with surgical precision, and flipped him onto the mat with a technique so clean even the instructor muttered. Perfect joint leverage takedown, textbook seal hand to hand. And the recruit lay there, shocked, wind knocked out, but uninjured, and she extended her hand, not mocking, not triumphant, simply offering respect. And when he accepted, something changed in the room. The recruits no longer saw her as a stranger in an outdated uniform, but as someone whose presence demanded silence. And yet she wasn't done teaching, because the next recruit asked, "Ma'am, how did you learn all of that?" Expecting a story, a secret, a miracle. But she answered with 3 quiet words, years of failure, and the room absorbed that, heavy and real. And then she continued, strength isn't built by winning. It's built by refusing to stay broken. And one of the female recruits, who had stayed silent earlier, stepped forward and asked softly, is that why you're here? And Evelyn looked around the room, not at their uniforms, not at their rank patches, but at the raw potential buried beneath ego, insecurity, and doubt. And she said, I'm here because one of you will replace me one day, and I won't hand that responsibility to someone who only looks strong. And with that, the entire room straightened, not out of fear, but respect, real respect, earned, undeniable, and heavy with meaning. And the training continued, drill after drill, test after test, each one pushing physical endurance, mental resilience, strategy, teamwork, and silence, because she didn't shout commands. She taught through example, precision, and outcome. And by midday, even the previously arrogant recruits were following her movements, studying every decision she made, and somewhere in between exhaustion and awe, they realized something. She didn't just carry authority, she embodied it. And by the time the sun cut sharp, golden lines through the high training windows, sweat dripped from uniforms, breaths shook with fatigue, yet no one complained because the woman they once mocked was still moving, still precise, still unwavering. And she hadn't taken a single water break. Not because she wanted to prove anything, but because she had trained her body through years of uncertainty, combat, deprivation, and missions where water wasn't guaranteed, rest wasn't promised, and hesitation meant loss. And after the final physical drill ended, she walked toward a long table covered with gear, radios, maps, encrypted tablets, tactical headsets, and field GPS units. And she said, strength without intelligence is reckless, and intelligence without adaptability is useless. Then she selected a random recruit and handed him a map, pointing to 3 marked locations. Find the fastest rescue route with minimal exposure, she said, and he tried, stuttering through terrain, descriptions, and vulnerable choke points. But his plan left open areas exposed to enemy fire. So she handed the map to another recruit who hesitated, overanalyzed, and failed to commit to any route. And then she took the map back and spoke, not boastfully, but with clarity sharpened through necessity. You choose terrain that protects movement, not terrain that impresses commanders. And with quick, fluid markings, she redesigned the mission path. But what stunned the room wasn't the strategy itself, it was the way she thought. Sideways, forward, backward, predicting failure points before they happened, planning not based on textbook logic but on war, survival, and the silent calculation of lives saved versus risks taken. And once she finished, she placed the map down and asked, why was my route faster? But before anyone answered, she continued, because I assumed everything would go wrong. Radios die, coordinates shift, weather changes, enemies adapt. Planning for perfection is planning for failure. And the room absorbed her words like oxygen after drowning, because no instructor had ever taught them fear as a tool instead of a weakness. And as silence settled again, the instructor stepped forward, clearing his throat with visible hesitation, then addressed the room. Recruits, most of you don't know this, but Lieutenant Commander Hayes isn't just a SEAL. She's one of the highest decorated active field officers in the program, responsible for saving teams that went missing in operations most of you will never read about. And a tremor moved through the room, a collective realization, not of fear, but of privilege, because being trained by someone of her caliber was rare, almost unheard of, and Evelyn didn't need praise. So she simply nodded to the instructor and moved on, selecting 3 recruits for a team-based infiltration simulation, assigning them roles instantly. Point Scout, Communications Lead, and Silent Entry Breacher, and she instructed the others to act as unpredictable obstacles, environmental hazards, time pressure, and silent sabotage. And the drill began with tension thick enough to feel in the air as the team attempted stealth movement, radio calls, map alignment, and silent code communication. And at first, they seemed coordinated, but the moment pressure increased, a simulated injury, sudden route block, surprise interference, cracks formed, communication faltered, panic flickered, and the mission derailed, ending in assumed capture, and some recruits braced themselves for anger, correction, or disappointment. But Evelyn simply asked, "What went wrong?" And for the first time since the day began, they answered honestly, not defensively, admitting miscommunication, hesitation, tunnel vision, and ego. And she nodded, not in judgment, but acknowledgement, saying, "Good." Failure with honesty is growth. Failure with excuses is rot. And then she reset the drill, but this time she didn't give orders. She made them create the plan themselves, watching silently as they delegated roles, adjusted strategies, and accounted for mistakes instead of pretending they didn't exist. And when the simulation restarted, something different happened. They moved quieter, listened more, trusted more, communicated without shouting. And when pressure arrived, and she made sure it did, they adapted. And this time, the mission succeeded, not perfectly, not quickly, but correctly. And when they finished, she didn't clap, didn't praise, didn't reward. She simply said, "Better," and somehow that single word carried more weight than applause ever could. And as exhaustion blended with pride in the room, Evelyn finally stepped toward the wall where old portraits of celebrated officers hung. Men with stern eyes, sharp uniforms, and decades of legacy. And she said quietly but firmly, "Greatness isn't inherited, it's earned in silence, in failure, and in moments no one sees." And then she turned back to them, eyes sharper now, voice lower, the kind of tone soldiers remember for the rest of their lives. And she said, "One day, the world will never know your names, your missions, or your sacrifices. But if you do this right, the ones who live because of you will never forget." And there was no arrogance, no lecture, just truth, heavy, grounded, permanent. And then she added, almost softly, "And that must be enough." And with that, training concluded, but no one moved. Not until she finally said, "Dismissed." And the recruits responded in perfect synchrony, not because they were ordered to, but because respect had become instinct. And as they dispersed, whispers no longer carried mockery, only admiration, disbelief, and deep inspiration. But one recruit, the same one who had laughed at her uniform that morning, lingered behind, stepping toward her hesitantly. And when she turned, he straightened and said, voice steady but humbled, "Commander, earlier I judged you before knowing anything about you, and I want to apologize." But she shook her head gently and replied, "Your mistake wasn't judgment. It was certainty." And he nodded, absorbing the lesson. And she added, "Doubt can lead to questions. Questions lead to learning. But certainty closes the door before truth enters." And the recruit swallowed hard before asking, "Will we ever be as good as you?" And she finally allowed a small, rare smile and answered, "If you train with humility, one day you'll be better." And with that, she walked toward the exit, boots echoing softly through the quiet hall. And just before she disappeared beyond the doorway, she paused, looked back once, and said, "Remember, strength is not loud, and heroes don't need recognition, only purpose." And then she left, not with the swagger of someone admired, but with the calm of someone who had already proven everything she needed. Not to them, but to herself and the world she served. And long after she was gone, the recruits continued training, replaying her movements, her words, her clarity, and her quiet dominance, knowing that someday they might face the same battlefield choices she had survived, and maybe if they carried her lessons, they would survive too. Not because they were fearless, but because they knew how to act despite fear. And that day, in a silent, unspoken shift, those recruits no longer wanted to be strong. They wanted to be worthy. And from that moment forward, none of them ever underestimated a quiet uniform again.